Welcome to the 2016 Fireside Chat. I'm Marilee Hansen, a former chair of the Executive Committee of the Environmental Law Section and an advisor to the Executive Committee. And I helped co-chair the group this year that reviewed the nominations for the Lifetime Achievement Award. And my fellow co-chair was Mark Lucebrink on my right, who's an outgoing member of the Executive Committee. Although it's the 25th anniversary of the Environmental Law Conference, it's only the third anniversary for the Lifetime Achievement Award, and it's only the second anniversary for the Fireside Chat. In 2014, we bestowed the award posthumously on Professor Joe Sachs. In 2015, we bestowed it on Clem Shute, who graciously agreed to do the very first Fireside Chat roughly a year ago in this same room, and it was facilitated by Tom McHenry and Jane Croscia, and I see Tom and Clem in the room tonight, and that really means a lot to us, and we feel honored that you're continuing the tradition. This year's winner of the 2016 Lifetime Achievement Award is Johanna Wald, and we felt that Johanna clearly met the criteria for someone who's made a significant contribution to California environmental law, has practiced with integrity, and has also served her community in many different ways. Facilitating the chat tonight is going to be Ellison Folk, who's a partner at Shute Mahali Weinberger in San Francisco, and also member of the Executive Committee for the Environmental Law Section. Ellison has known Johanna for almost 30 years, so we thought that she was clearly qualified.
Did I hear not true over there?
No, I said really.
At least she didn't say wrong.
Why?
So we thought she was uniquely qualified to do the job tonight, and we know that it's going to be a really valuable experience for everyone. We passed around cards. If you have any questions, please write them down on the cards, pass them down. We'll collect them, and hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So with the introductions out of the way, I want to present to you the 2016 Lifetime Achievement Award winner from the Environmental Law Section of the State Bar of California, Ms. Johanna Wald.
I'm going to start crying.
You have to wait. So I thought I'd just start by saying, yes, I did meet Johanna 1987. And it was before I even went to law school, and I worked for an environmental group that had its office in the offices of NRDC. I worked with Annie Notoff here. And I was trying to remember when this happened, but Johanna had moved into San Francisco from Palo Alto, and she ended up living in the same neighborhood as me. And she invited me to walk to work with her every day. And I just remember thinking at the time that it was such a nice gesture because, I was really like nobody then. And I think there's been, just that making of a connection with a very junior person was such a generous thing to do. And I know there's a whole generation of lawyers out there who have had similar experiences with Johanna. And so I'm really honored to be here tonight and be able to ask you some questions. And I think I'll just start, maybe start with the beginning of your environmental law career, that is, and ask how you got your start in environmental law.
So I got my start purely by luck. It was 1972. NRDC had just opened its first Western office in Palo Alto, where I was then living, and they were looking for a full-time lawyer to join their staff. They couldn't find one. So they settled for a part-time lawyer. That would be me.
Yeah, and you told me a story about how you wanted so much to work that when they told you they were looking for a full-time attorney, you cried.
Well, I didn't cry in front of the person that I was talking to, but I was really devastated. I had been living in Palo Alto for about 4 years by that time, and I simply could not find a legal job, no matter how hard I had tried. So for me, NRDC was sort of the last resort. And I was incredibly lucky that they hired me. And I was luckier still because what began as just a job for me developed into a passion for the public lands, for protecting them and improving their management. I was also incredibly lucky in that NRDC turned out to be the kind of place where I could grow and flourish as a lawyer, as an environmental advocate, as a woman and a wife and a mother, and as a leader of the organization as well as the community outside it. I also have to say that it was a lucky place for me in the sense that I got to work with so many wonderful people, not just NRDC people, but other people, many of whom I'm glad to see here tonight.
Yeah. Well, I do want to talk a little bit more later about, you know, your experience as a woman practicing law and as an environmental lawyer. But I thought it might be nice actually to talk a little bit about some of the work you did at NRDC and how, because Johanna really did play an instrumental role in developing the law around public lands protection, especially in the Western United States. And I think you started with cows.
I did. On the very first day that I showed up to work at NRDC, I chose the issue of livestock grazing on the public lands to work on. To this day, I do not understand why I chose that issue. I knew nothing about cows except that they were a source of food. I knew even less about grazing. And like most Americans at that time, I'd never even heard of the public lands or of the Bureau of Land Management. But the fact is that then, as now, livestock grazing is the most extensive economic use made of the public lands under the BLM's jurisdiction. It occurs on some 160 million acres of lands, mostly all of which are located in the West. In 1972, when I started, decision-making about how this use was going to be conducted on the public lands, how many cows were going to be allowed to graze, where they were going to be allowed to graze, when they were going to be allowed to graze, for how long. All those kinds of decisions were a private affair between the BLM range managers and the ranchers who had permits to graze. Essentially, the only other people besides the ranchers and the BLM who knew about these lands or anything about their resources were people who lived in local communities. The vast majority of Americans, the other owners of these lands, didn't even know that they existed, didn't know where they were located because they weren't on any maps. They didn't know what resources they supported, and they didn't know anything about what was happening to them. And there was absolutely no way that they could participate in these key decisions about how this use was going to be managed. So under the circumstances, it wasn't so surprising to me to discover that grazing was being mismanaged across vast areas of the West. Overgrazing was taking place on millions of acres. Wildlife habitat and water quality were being degraded native vegetation and topsoil were being lost as the result of the decisions that were being made behind closed doors. It was 1972. It was only a few years after NEPA had been passed, and in very short order, I decided that NEPA was the best tool available to change the way this decision-making was going on. Not surprisingly, the BLM, like the other federal management agencies, didn't agree. So we sued them, claiming that the Bureau was obligated to analyze the impacts of grazing on particular areas of the public lands. Much to their surprise, we won that case. That was one of a number of cases entitled NRDC versus Morton, and required the agency to prepare hundreds of environmental impact statements. These statements, for the first time ever, revealed to the American public what was happening on these lands. They were a way for people to understand what resources these lands supported, where they were located, what grazing was doing to them. And as I had hoped when we filed the lawsuit, people who read these documents got extremely concerned about what was going on. And as a result, and after some time, we literally put the public lands on the map. And as a result of the lawsuit, new laws were passed, new regulations governing the administration of grazing on the public land were promulgated, and the agency itself began to change.
Yeah, I think you told me a funny story about going to a meeting at BLM and learning about what the impact had been of these cases there.
Right, so this was right at the beginning of the Obama administration. I was in the Interior Department for a meeting, and I walked up to the room where the meeting was scheduled, and there were a lot of people in it, and they were moving around. And I just assumed that they were the people in my meeting, so I opened the door and walked right in. They weren't the people in my meeting, but somebody there recognized me. I didn't know him, but he came up to me and he said, "Do you know who all these people are?" And I said, "No, who are they?" And he said, "They're some of the NRDC versus B. Morton babies." And that was a term that they had given themselves, the huge influx of people that the Bureau had to hire in order to respond to our lawsuit. Some of them were range managers, but the other were biologists and botanists and archaeologists and the kind of people who had never been part of the agency before. And they, from the inside, began the Bureau's transformation into a modern land management agency. I regret to say that that transformation hasn't been completed yet, but it is ongoing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great example of environmental regulation as a job creator. So I know you've worked on other issues over the years at NRDC, but I thought it might be nice to talk about sort of how you maybe closed out your career at NRDC and your work on climate change issues and solar energy, renewable energy, sort of as the bracket to your career.
Right. So that was work that I began about 5 years before I retired. I was introduced to it again through luck. I was on the telephone one day with someone in the BLM, and he just casually happened to mention that there were hundreds of applications for utility-scale renewable energy projects, mostly solar projects, pending in the California Desert District of the Bureau, and that more were expected any day. I was unbelievably shocked. I didn't understand how this could have happened to the lands that I had been working so hard over so many years to protect, and that I didn't even know about it. So I began to investigate this brand new threat to the public lands, and in the course of that, of course, I discovered that there was another, even more serious threat to those lands, namely climate change. I was equally, if not more, shocked to realize that climate change, which I must say until that point in time I had thought was a very distant threat, was already having an impact on the resources of the desert. I learned, for example, that Joshua trees were already in big trouble and that they were expected to vanish from 90% of their range if nothing was done about climate change. So here I'm sort of at the end of my career, and I find out I have two brand new threats that I have to deal with. Well, these developments caused me to think about the public lands in a wholly different way, because until then, I hadn't realized that in addition to all the other resources that I was familiar with that they were supporting, they had great and abundant renewable energy resources. I know I don't have to tell any of you that developing these resources has major, major environmental impacts. You know, wind turbines can kill migratory birds, golden eagles, potentially they can even kill California condors, and they always seriously fragment wildlife habitats. Solar projects, a single solar project can take up thousands of acres and permanently put an end to any other use those lands might have, whether for wildlife or open space. And because these renewable resources are located in many of them in extremely remote areas, developing these projects meant miles and miles of new roads and even more miles and miles and miles and miles of transmission lines. So clearly, citing these projects was a really important key to dealing with them. But at the time, I didn't have any idea what that meant. So NRDC and I began to address these related threats at a variety of different levels. The first thing I did was to reach out to conservation and environmental groups that I had been dealing with over my career and sit down with them so that we could get a common understanding of these new technologies, their risks, and their benefits. And after we did that, we tried to figure out a way, a common approach to them, an approach that we could all get behind, that would involve solutions, potential solutions, and would also involve agreement on ways to press for those solutions. We called our approach Smart from the Start. And basically what it entailed was saying that this kind of development should be encouraged on lands that had already been significantly disturbed from, say, mining or oil and gas development because of their potential impacts. And that lands that were unique and sensitive, like wilderness quality lands or important wildlife areas, should be protected from this kind of development. At the same time, we said that lands that were close to roads or close to transmission lines should be favored over those that were not. We also argued that if you really wanted to get these huge projects built, you should stay away from the unique and sensitive lands, because proposals, even even the idea that these lands could be used for this purpose was sure to generate a lot of controversy and conflict and then delay. So if you wanted to get projects built, you should focus on the disturbed lands, and in that way minimize the time and the effort and the energy that would be involved in getting them permitted, to say nothing of built. We also engaged directly with proponents of these projects, as well as with the Bureau. We worked with proponents in order to improve their projects and to improve their understanding of what made a site appropriate and what didn't. We had a fair amount of success, I would say, in terms of the individual projects. We got some of the worst ones withdrawn, and several others were improved in really significant ways. At the policy level, we worked with the Bureau, the Interior Department, the developers, and other stakeholders to convince them to adopt an approach that was, in effect, smart from the start. We advocated that the Bureau should affirmatively guide development to pre-selected appropriate areas rather than leave the developers in the driver's seat free to choose any area that they wanted and leaving the rest of us in the position of having to react to their proposals.
So I know that when you did this work that you had to, that this is,
Yes.
protecting these lands had been very important to you, and that you ended up having to, sometimes be on the other side of people who had been your allies for years.
Right.
And that-
So all of this work was incredibly hard for me, but the hardest of all was actually identifying lands that could be used for this purpose. I did think of myself as the defender of these lands, and here I was offering them up. I sometimes actually got physically ill as the result of having to say yes to a project in a particular area, or having to say yes to putting a particular area on a list that we gave to the Bureau. And I did lose some friends and former clients, people that I'd worked with over many years over this issue. Not people that I was truly close to, but I did receive some really horrible emails in which people said some really terrible things about me in the misguided hope that that would cause me to give up what I was doing.
Yeah.
Because, though, I had brought along a lot of other environmental organizations, I wasn't alone in the work, and also because I was really driven by the notion that something had to be done in response to climate change. The public lands had never faced a threat like climate change before, so the ways in which we had traditionally worked didn't seem to me to be the ways that we could continue to work in the face of that threat. Yeah. And so it was relatively easy to convince myself, even at the worst moments, that I was doing the right thing. But it was sometimes unbelievably hard.
Right. Well, now I think we just have a few minutes left. I want to shift gears a little bit and actually talk about. You're going to check me on this. Yeah. Your experience practicing law as a woman, and actually, even your experience in law school, and what it was like, going to law school in the 60s, I guess. And
Well, when I went to law school, there were very, very few women lawyers across the country, and there were very, very few women in my class. In fact, there were 10 women in my class and 10 women in the classes in front of me, and then there were 10 women in the classes behind me. The administration said that they didn't have a quota. But of course they did. Yeah.
yeah, and I thought that you had an interesting story about what sort of the effect that the Vietnam War had on the selection of people for
Right.
school, or so.
Right. So the reason why there are so many women lawyers now is because of the Vietnam War. Basically, law schools were rightly concerned that their male students would be drafted. And so in order to ensure that they had enough students in their classes, they decided to admit, and in some cases even recruit, women. And lo and behold, there were lots more than just 10 women who wanted to go to law schools around the country. And that's when we started to see the numbers and percentages of women in this profession really, really change.
Right. I think you even told me that when initially the student deferment was if you were married, you got a student deferment, and then they changed it to if you were married and had a child, you could get a student deferment.
So everybody got pregnant, of course.
Wasn't your daughter born around then?
Yes.
Anyway, so, you started at NRDC. You must have been one of the few women.
Yes. Although, even when I began at NRDC, there were a few women on the staff. But I would say for more than half my career, is this right, Annie? That men way outnumbered women, and they certainly dominated the management ranks. Mm-hmm. It was true also, I think, at the Interior Department. I think when I started, there was one or maybe two women lawyers in the entire department. The change at NRDC was quite gradual, at least in my memory, and it was marked by increasing numbers of women on the staff, increasing numbers of children associated with women on the staff, and by how whenever a baby came to visit the office, the halls would be clogged with women who'd stop what they were doing to come out to check out the baby.
And Bruce Babbitt also played a role?
Yes.
Yeah.
So at the Interior Department, I think the change was a great deal more dramatic, and I do think that Bruce Babbitt, who became the Secretary of the Interior in '93, was largely the cause of that. He and his team were determined to bring women into the agencies, and especially the management ranks of all the agencies. In fact, I remember going to a BLM retreat for field managers that Babbitt held at a resort in Lake Tahoe early in the first Clinton administration. And there were so many women there that at the breaks, the line from the ladies' room ran down the hall, out the lobby, and out the front door.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a big change from 10
Yes.
women in law school. And then maybe we could close with just talking about being an environmental lawyer. And, I was really struck last year when we did Clem's Fireside Chat about how the first generation of environmental lawyers almost fell into it by accident. And I'm just wondering when you started to think of yourself as an environmental lawyer.
Well, I think it was relatively early. although I don't remember exactly what year it was, but I remember what precipitated it. I was having a conversation with a friend who worked at another public interest organization. That's what we called ourselves then. And he told me about a conversation he'd just had with someone who worked for a California state agency that he had just successfully sued. And this state person said something like this to him. He said, "I bet you're feeling really good about that lawsuit that you won, aren't you?" He said, "But you shouldn't. Nothing is going to change as the result. You are going to move on from this job or this issue, and I am going to stay here." And I said, "Wow. I wonder if that's the way the BLM feels." I had just won my first big case. And I said, "Well, if that's the way they feel, I'll show them. I won't leave." And I didn't, not for 40 years.
Do you want to take time now for questions? I could do more if you want. But.
Do people have any cards to pass down here?
Well, I do have one more question for you, which your point about being persistent and not going away. It's something I tell my clients all the time. If you're fighting an environmental issue, is you have to be in there for the long haul, because you can win once and it 6 months later the same issue is going to come back again. And I just wonder if you have any advice for young people going into environmental law or even young attorneys, for that matter.
So I think I have 3 pieces of advice, 2 of which definitely relate to what you've just said, Ellison. I mean, the first is, this work is really hard. And I at least couldn't do it by myself. So I think people should find someone they like to work with, someone whose sense of humor you enjoy, whose skill set complements yours, whose work style meshes with yours, so that when things get really, really tough, you can lean on each other for support. In fact, for many years, I worked very, very closely on grazing issues with a member of the Sierra Club who lived in Nevada. And the 2 of us had an explicit agreement. When one of us was down in the dumps, the other one could not be there. And that way, we each had someone who could pull us out of the hole we dug for ourselves. Second, I think I would say that you shouldn't do this if you need regular victories or constant signs of progress. In my work, at least, and I know in the work of many other people at NRDC and other organizations and at law firms, those kinds of metrics of success came all too rarely. I did the work that I did because I really cared about the lands and resources that I was trying to protect, and I did it for them and for the people who loved them as much as I did. If you don't have a reason like that, I think you still need to have some kind of a reason, whether it's a particular place, an idea, a concept. That way, when you don't have success, or as is even more frequent, I suspect, when you can't see a single indication that you're making any progress at all, the fact that you're trying to advance something that's positive can be a reward in and of itself. And the third thing I would say, and it is really important, is that you should enjoy the environment whenever and wherever you can.
Nice. Okay, well, we have a few questions here. And the first is, what is your view of the wild horse stocking storage issue? I don't want to put you on the spot, and there may be horse lovers in the audience. So.
Well, I'm kind of a horse sympathizer because there are only a tiny fraction of horses compared to cows. It's kind of like when I was in law school. It is true that many people who don't like wild horses don't like them because they compete with livestock for a very limited supply. But it is also true that wild horses can do very, very severe damage to public lands, to vegetation, to water sources, and in some cases, they do more severe damage than cows do. So something has to be done about them. The problem is the alternatives are so limited. I'm sure this question was prompted by a New York Times article that said all of the money of the Bureau of Land Management that has been appropriated to deal with wild horses is going to store them. So there's no way to figure out, there are no resources to figure out what to do to get their numbers down. One thing that doesn't seem to be working is darting them so that they won't reproduce. And the other solution, which would cause an uproar, is killing them. It's a very hard problem,
Yeah.
which I stayed away from.
So we have a question about climate change in public lands, and I think this is going to the issue of how will we manage the impacts of climate change on public lands. And I know yesterday, was it John Jaspers,
No, but it's John somebody.
Jarvis, sorry.
Thank you.
Who spoke about the changes that are happening on public lands because of climate change and the impacts on like the sequoias and glaciers. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, my thoughts are we have to figure out how to do it, but we're pretty far still, I think, from figuring out exactly what to do. So in the renewable energy work that I did, what we tried to do was create places where renewable energy could go, which at the same time didn't impede, for example, wildlife corridors, so that wildlife could get from one place where it's too hot to some place where it's not too hot, or one place where there's no vegetation to some place where there is the kind of vegetation that they eat. So we have to figure out those kinds of things to the extent that we can, but I think we are still not yet at a point where we can predict with any degree of certainty exactly what it is that we have to do. I mean, basically, we have to remember what Aldo Leopold said, was that everything is connected to everything else, and sort of try to figure out a way in which to leave as many options open to us as we possibly can in order to deal with impacts as we discover.
Well, I don't know if we have any other questions. I would like to say thank you. I really enjoyed having this opportunity. I'm so glad that you're here and that you.
Well, I would like to say thank you to you, Allison, and to all of you for having me here. Thank you. Thank you all.